Chapter 7 Beast 2020 Somewhere in Southeast Asia. Jesse was adrift in a sea of memory as he strolled through the sparse broadleaf forest. His eyes swam in the brilliant blue of the sky as he went where his bare feet took him. The ground was coated in a thick layer of dead leaves that provided satisfying crunches as he stomped on them. A light breeze ran through the myriad of tall trees surrounding him. Bamboo was becoming more common, which Jesse assumed meant he'd travelled far enough for a change in geography. Where he was, he didn't know, and right now, he didn't particularly care. Of all the topics that frequently swam across Jesse's mind, today's was monsters. He'd been fortunate enough to come across a stash of old books in a Vietnam War-era structure, all in English. Many had been damaged beyond legibility by the elements, though a good dozen had survived, and Jesse had devoured them. In his wild world without a TV or movies, he'd forgotten how engrossing a book could be. There'd been one large tome dedicated to describing mythological creatures. Naturally, Jesse had dived into it in search of werewolves, and learned a lot. The curse indeed came from Greece, and had started with a man named Lycaon. He'd also learned that Greek myth held a bizarre array of odd creatures, leaving Jesse wondering how many of them were real. Unfortunately, the book had no mention of gods like Baron Samedi. Still, Jesse found himself reading it front to back, over and over, in the hopes of better understanding the curse that afflicted him. Ironically, he'd decided that in a world of potential monsters, being a werewolf wasn't the worst possible outcome. He'd left the denser portion of the forest behind as he'd moved steadily downhill, traversing the southern ridge of a canyon. He admired the beauty out here. The landscape was vast and untouched, with a primordial air about it. The stink and corruption of humanity hadn't touched this wilderness. Life was abundant and rich in its diversity. Jesse had learned to tolerate his perpetual hunger, as best he could, scavenging when an opportunity presented itself. Food. Jesse paused. There was a faint scent being carried in the breeze. It was meat, and it wasn't rotten. There was a dead animal nearby. Jesse began sprinting like a madman. His inner optimist prayed that a deer had met its untimely end nearby. If he could start a fire, he could feast. A deer could provide several days' worth of food. His clumsy human body, despite being supernaturally enhanced, wasn't suited to hunting such agile prey. Venison could be a real treat. As Jesse followed his nose, the forest grew sparser. Fields of grass with small yellow flowers greeted the unkempt traveller as he rushed carelessly forward, not concerned with alerting the local wildlife to his presence. Jesse had come across bears and jackals in his wanderings. He hadn't dared tangle with a bear, but the jackals were skittish and could be frightened away with a stick. I hope it's jackals, Jesse prayed as he leapt over a decaying tree. He pushed through a swath of green bamboo stalks and emerged by a small clearing. A deer, quite obviously dead, was lying half submerged in the shadows of the trees not more than a dozen yards away. The leaf litter around it was stained red, and there were clearly injuries to the beast's neck. Something powerful had killed this animal. Jesse scanned the clearing, noting its eerie stillness. Though nothing seemed particularly untoward here. There was no movement in the dense brush shielding the forest. He didn't want to wait for a predator to return for its prize. His impatience directed his actions. Forsaking the cover the environment offered, Jesse strode into the long grass. As the light of day bathed his lonely figure, everything changed. Jesse's pulse quickened. His senses grew instantly sharper as his body responded to an unseen threat. His muscles tensed, ready to fight or flee on his command. Something was here. Something that was used to hiding. "Show yourself," Jesse growled through gritted teeth. A much more sinister growl reverberated through the undergrowth in response. Jesse snapped left and saw the brushes moving. He caught a flash of orange as an obscured figure darted through the shadows. Then, it was still again. The soothing caress of the breeze returned as if the danger had never been present. Still, the thickets engulfing the sides of the clearing had taken on a menacing quality. Jesse stood frozen in place, not daring to move an inch. It wasn't a greedy impulse, but fear that commanded his actions now. He looked back at the deer. Its soulless, vacant eyes bore into him as if their nothingness held a tremendous warning he'd failed to heed. "I will leave you to your prize," Jesse announced, hoping that the lurker in the undergrowth would understand his meaning and let him depart without incident. After waiting for a minute, Jesse began backing towards the trees. His eyes continuously scanned the area, preempting the signs of an attack. Nothing. The tree line was now within arm's reach. Just a few more steps and he would be free of this unseen hunter. The hairs on Jesse's arms stood erect, preventing him from taking the last lunge backwards. He turned, sensing the danger that now lay directly behind him. The attack came fast. A blur of orange and black exploded from the undergrowth. The mound of muscle and fur barreled into Jesse, knocking him into the clearing. Long yellow claws ripped at his exposed chest, splashing crimson blood across the grass. Jesse was instantly aware of the pain overwhelming his nervous system. He quickly comprehended the immense proportion of his foe as its weight crushed him. With its blazing orange coat and deathly yellow eyes, the tiger loomed over him like an ancient jungle god. It bared its teeth, then roared. The shock and fear passed quickly. Jesse's survival instincts kicked in. The tiger's menacing canines gleamed in the sun as it thrust them towards Jesse's throat. His fingers moved like lightning, catching the beast's head by its upper and lower jaws. Saliva ran across his hands and down his arms as the beast struggled to finish its prey. It moved, its claws slicing across Jesse's stomach. His skin tore and his muscles convulsed, but he didn't relinquish his grip. Even the merest flinch now could spell his end. Jesse didn't want to be like the deer, only a few feet away. A lifeless corpse in the forest, a victim to a superior predator. "I am the predator," Jesse screamed, mustering all his strength as he pulled the big cat's jaws apart. He could feel the sinew of its mouth stretch and its bones snap as he pulled. The tiger relented, rearing in surprise and jumping free of Jesse's dangerous hands. It shook its head vigorously in its agony. Emboldened, Jesse scrambled to his feet. He looked down and saw the rips on his stomach healing already, albeit slowly. The tiger's claws had dug deep. He caught his breath as he surveyed his foe. The tiger had to be triple his weight. He splayed his arms out in a vain attempt to appear bigger. The tiger roared as if dismissing Jesse's display as pathetic. It was the king of this land and couldn't be frightened so easily. The tiger eyed him with more than contempt now. There was intrigue in its sparkling eyes. Its protracted claws scraped the earth as it bore its fangs. This time, Jesse was ready for the leap. He saw the beast's muscles tense before it sprang from the grass. The cat sailed past Jesse as he dived right, losing his footing and landing hard on his shoulder. He felt it dislocate, the pain proving momentarily disorienting. The tiger spun. Its teeth found Jesse's left calf, puncturing through skin and muscle down to the bone. Jesse aimed an ungainly kick into the side of the tiger's head with his free leg, freeing his mutilated calf from its maw. Again on the ground, with a now useless left leg and a dangling right arm, Jesse couldn't get back to his feet. Worse still, the tiger was rounding on him again, greedily eyeing his neck. It knew what it had to do to subdue him, whereas Jesse had no idea how to escape the beast. "Get away!" Jesse gasped as his shoulder popped back into place. He noticed that his leg wasn't healing. The tiger swatted at Jesse with its powerful forelimbs. Its claws cut through his shattered body like he was made of butter. Jesse's face was splashed with swaths of his own blood. The red liquid burned in his eyes, temporarily blinding him. The wind changed. The tiger's head pushed through Jesse's arms and towards his esophagus. He knew it was moving to end this fight. Jesse blocked his neck with his forearm, feeling the bones snap as the tiger clamped down on it. This was life or death. Jesse had no intention of submitting to the beast's will, no matter how much pain it inflicted upon him. His free hand searched for the cat's eye socket, finding it quickly. Jesse pushed his thumb and forefinger into the tiger's eye, feeling something give, like a blood vessel bursting. Then a howl of pain. The tiger released its jaw from Jesse's mutilated arm and doubled back. Jesse was satisfied he'd finally been able to injure this sturdy foe. Hopefully, it would be enough to drive the beast away. The tiger roared, and Jesse roared back at it. His broken forearm wasn't healing at all. It simply dangled, useless and limp. Jesse couldn't defend himself any longer. If the tiger chose to strike again, it could all be over. The tiger shook its head violently, then pounced back into the brush. The vegetation trembled, then went still. Jesse breathed a welcome sigh of relief. It seemed that, for now at least, the fight was over. He couldn't stay here though, yet he was helpless to move. There was a clicking sound as the bones in his forearm rejoined. Jesse screamed in agony as this unexpected act brought him to near unconsciousness. Then, rather unexpectedly, Jesse laughed. His supernatural healing factor wasn't completely depleted. Somehow, once again, despite difficult odds, he'd walk out of this. After 20 minutes, Jesse was able to pull himself to his feet. Then, after an hour of limping, he began to walk again. Jesse scrambled back up the ridge, away from the tiger's kingdom, with a newfound respect for the other monsters of this forest. He'd begun to think himself above the natural world, and it was as if the tiger had appeared to remind him that that wasn't the case. Jesse, a supernatural monster, had almost been killed by a large cat. There was a lesson in there for him to digest, but not before a long period of healing had taken place. Any delusion that the forest was now his home was shattered. He didn't belong anywhere. Chapter 8. Drums, 2020. Somewhere in Southeast Asia. Jesse was a wreck of a man. His only companions were the chirps of unseen birds and the shuffling shadows of monkeys high in the treetops. For a time, before the tiger, he'd embraced being one with nature. The diversity of the jungle was endless, and Jesse had become a part of its ecosystem. He could smell, hear, and see so clearly now. A clarity that was almost spiritual in nature enveloped him, or so he'd thought. Jesse wasn't like a child suckling at the teat of the earth. He was an unwelcome parasite in a foreign land. He knew he didn't truly belong, and never could. A deep, irrepressible part of his psyche longed for the comforts and regularity of civilization. The animals avoided him, smelling his unnatural affliction. This only served to reinforce Jesse's feeling of absolute isolation. The struggle for survival had become an all-consuming objective. One mistake could spell doom, though Jesse had numerous advantages. His injuries, no matter how grievous, healed quickly. He'd fallen down steep embankments, accidentally impaled himself on a branch, and been shot at when he'd stumbled across poachers. Yet, he always recovered as if nothing had happened. Jesse's body was racked with additional scars besides the werewolf wounds. He'd quickly learned that his magic healing factor had a limit, and he had to be careful not to exceed it. Jesse's hair was long and matted with mud. He had a scraggly beard dominating the lower portion of his face and neck. He could hardly recognize himself when he caught glimpses of his gaunt figure in the still forest pools. Who was this emaciated stranger staring up at him with wild eyes? His diet consisted mostly of rats. How he longed for home-cooked meals and a warm place to rest. But it wasn't meant to be. He was a monster, and not fit to be in society any longer. And yet, thoughts of his family and friends couldn't escape him. He wondered where Josh was now. Was he still a lab rat? At least Jesse had his freedom. Months passed in loneliness and dread for Jesse Bilyeu. His transformations had always left him disoriented and confused, but at least he didn't wake up surrounded by innocent victims. The werewolf inside seemed content to hunt in the forest during the full moon. Its long-range wanderings kept Jesse far from the reach of the AST, who'd almost caught up with him once or twice. Jesse stuck to the deepest, thickest parts of the jungle to avoid being tracked. Whenever he heard vehicles, he took it as an indication that he was going the wrong way. He never stayed in one place too long. The more that Jesse became lost in the wilderness of Southeast Asia, the more he became lost with himself. He didn't even know if he was in Vietnam anymore. When he stumbled near villages, quite by accident, he heard different languages and dialects. It was better that he didn't know where he was. If he didn't know, how could the AST? Liam Sager's scowling face was burned into Jesse's brain. While he couldn't live in society, he still refused to be a lab rat. Jesse was a monster, cursed to live among the beasts of the land. This was his life. On an uncomfortably warm night, Jesse was woken by an odd sound. There was a series of far-off hollers and hoots carrying on the breeze. It was as if a monumental party was happening out in the forest. But that was impossible. Jesse was sure he was far beyond the reach of human habitation. Jesse got to his feet, listening keenly. It wasn't just sound. There were smells too. The aroma of people. Dozens of people. His tiredness quickly abated as this new mystery revealed itself. Jesse had adapted to the night. He could see well enough and found a thick tree to climb. As he burst through the pitch-black canopy, he was met by an orange glow igniting the night. It looked like a large bonfire in a distant clearing, only a few kilometers away at most. This odd occurrence had to be investigated. Jesse considered the possibility of poachers, though that was unlikely. They never willingly invited their own discovery. This party was so obvious and loud it had to be something else. Jesse pulled a tattered tunic over his head. He'd found it after his last transformation, and it was now his only piece of clothing. Jesse breathed in, letting odor particles flood his nostrils. He caught the scent, and now had to navigate the dark paths of the jungle. The journey was quick. Jesse stayed clear of the chattering voices from the disparate groups moving in the gloom. There were parties of no more than 5 people heading towards the bonfire from all directions, guided by torchlight. The people made a lot of noise, apparently wholly unconcerned with masking their presence out here. Stranger still were the words they uttered, sounding alien to Jesse. There was something about these wanderers in the night that Jesse found unsettling, as if to be in their vicinity was to trespass into an ancient and unknown sin. Where they converged was madness unlike Jesse had ever seen. This meeting in the forest had no organization or structure, other than the enormous circle of fire burning amongst the trees. As soon as the men and women were bathed in the orange warmth from the tall, manicured flames, they undressed and moved into a mass of dancing people. Jesse couldn't make any sense of this. The people flailed and danced in the firelight as if gripped with unhinged ecstasy. They spasmed and gyrated to a tune without melody or rhythm. Drums beat and flutes played with no unity or precision. It was just raw, unfiltered noise. Jesse watched a man stumble past, his eyes rolling in his skull and foam dripping from his mouth. He noticed that the braver madmen would throw themselves through the wall of fire into an obscured inner circle. Jesse felt the acute pull of the mystery here, part of him wanting to throw away his tunic and join in to investigate. Another voice in his brain warned against such an action. It was like he was in the presence of a horrific power, one that shouldn't be made aware of him. A hand touched Jesse's shoulder, almost causing him to leap in fright. He swallowed his fear as a shadow slithered into place beside him. A shadow that took on a familiar form. Jesse recognized the skull mask of Baron Samedi. The god of the dead was back. I need to see what's inside the ring of fire, Jesse began to explain, pausing as he processed the sound of his own voice. Now, Jesse Billieu, Baron Samedi whispered, a hint of warning in his voice. This is not a place for exploration. But surely this is voodoo, the madness of it. This is your religion. The thought had occurred to Jesse when he saw the wildness of the people. It also helped to explain Baron Samedi's presence in Southeast Asia. What do you know of voodoo? The god asked. Jesse paused. He actually knew nothing about the Haitian religion. The image of a doll with pins poking through it popped into his head. Nothing really, Jesse mumbled. Baron Samedi didn't appear to find Jesse's ignorance insulting. The first voodoo temples were built where African slaves ran away to pray. It is also a religion heavily linked with nature. The people invite the deities of the rivers, valleys, and mountains into their bodies and make covenants with them. Then they dance in the sacred places. That is not what we are witnessing here. I thought you said they worshipped the Christian god. I'm glad you remember. Yes, God is the supreme deity of the voodoo religion. But the old African gods act as guiding spirits to my followers. In voodoo, everything that happens is due to the direct intervention of the spirits, whether good or bad. The people make offerings, and the spirits take possession for a short time. And that isn't this? No, there are no gods here. Just a call to the void and the malevolent things that squirm in the dark. The way the Baron said it made Jesse shudder. It was good to know that his gut instinct hadn't been wrong about this gathering. This wasn't a wholesome place to be. I think it is time I continued telling you my story, as we are not at risk of being overheard here. Jesse watched the people dancing as he prepared to let his mind absorb the Baron's words. I told you of my brigade, the great flame that changed my destiny. If you remember, I was an agent of hell, causing chaos. Maman Brigette served the church, though I never told you why. Why would a god of the old world be willing to serve the power that destroyed her home and ended her way of life? Because she saw a greater threat. A secret threat lingering out of view of even the angels. This ritual here is that very same threat. It began in colonial Africa. Brother sold brother into slavery. Humans were traded as mere possessions across the world, deemed of lesser value because of unchangeable physical attributes. Despair ran rampant as atrocities became normal life. In that despair and in that hopelessness, something dark festered. Long tentacles found anchor in the weakened minds of the oppressed and tortured, and manipulated them through dreams. Maman Brigette showed me the dances in the firelight. She let me hear the beating drums and piping flutes in the dark. The calls to dark deities filled my ears and I dismissed them. She warned me of powers beyond God himself, and I laughed at the notion. Then I met him. Jessie couldn't help but notice that Baron Samedi looked incredibly grim. Who? The Sundered King, he called himself. A lonely figure who walked in the remote places of the world. He sought out the disenfranchised and the lost. Wherever he appeared, these rituals began. What was he? A god like you? To this day I can't be sure. He was a broken figure, in service to something greater than himself. Something that viewed all life as a game. It was in Haiti that we met, during a period of great unrest. Maman Brigette told me not to engage with such a fellow. His hatred of the gods was palpable. But I was a knight of hell, so what did I care? A fallen angel of mighty God. What he showed me was terrifying beyond God or Satan, beyond anything in this small world. I knew that I couldn't let the people fall under his spell. The beliefs of the church had been pushed onto the people of Haiti, though unsuccessfully. I turned my efforts to aid in Maman Brigette to draw the masses away from the Sundered King's infestation and to God, the lesser of two evils. It didn't work. The fires grew as the people continued to dance, inviting things from the void into their minds. That's when I changed tact. I asked Maman Brigette to help me recruit the gods of Africa, those who'd survived, to blend the old and the new. I let the people continue to dance, but instead, they would invite the gods of their ancestors into their bodies. Heaven pardoned the African gods and allowed this new religion to form, as prayer was still going to the one God. Voodoo was born in earnest, and it was for this I earned my apotheosis. The people came to see me as their god of life and death, and in doing so, I became it, shedding the name Samyaza and becoming Samedi. But this evil religion of the Sundered King is happening right here, right now, Jessie began, feeling somewhat like he was missing the point. You only stopped it in a small part of the world, but not everywhere. This sickness has infested all of human history. In time you will help us stop it, but that time is not now. Jessie watched the mad flailing of the dancers in silence for a long moment. Clearly, the machinations of gods wasn't something meant to be easily understood. So, this isn't voodoo, Jessie concluded lamely, after processing the god's words. This is older than voodoo. This dance is unhinged and chaotic, born of dark dreams from sunken places. It serves no purpose, other than allowing the body to release itself to the true primal. Jessie couldn't help but notice the angst with which Baron Samedi spoke. It was almost as if he feared these people. Who are they? Where have they come from? Jessie asked. He couldn't help but be intimidated by the fire reflectively dancing on the Baron's death mask. Everywhere and nowhere. Are you being deliberately vague? Jessie sighed, annoyed. Yes, Baron Samedi smiled. Your mind is fragile, and you are touched by forces beyond the natural order. This is a bad place for you to be right now. The fact that the cult is active here means that your time in the jungle must end. Are you going to help me? He was immensely confused as to why this self-proclaimed god had appeared 3 times, only for Jessie's life to get worse after each visit. I will help as any friend would, with some advice, the Baron responded. What advice? The forest is dangerous. After the next full moon, it would be in your best interest to return to society. You know what I've done. My hands are soaked in the blood of the innocent. This is where I belong, away from society. Things are changing. The festival we look upon is proof of that. Take the advice of the god of the dead." The pair paused as a chant emerged amongst the dancers. It grew louder and louder as more of the wild people joined the chorus. The words again were utterly alien to Jesse, though he did pick up on some of the phrases being repeated. There was Yog Sothoth, Neolethotep and Cthulhu, phrases that meant nothing to him. However, they seemed to release a new wave of ecstasy through the convulsing dancers. "Be warned, Jesse, that a time will come when you seek me out. Go to Haiti, find the black goats. They will lead you to me." "I don't understand," Jesse began, but was cut off by the Baron. "I think it would be unwise for you to mention our meetings here. The river of time does not always flow in its proper direction, and I'd rather its disruptions not drown us all." While Jesse didn't understand the Baron's meaning, he could tell the seriousness of the words. Jesse noticed a man in a hooded robe moving through the crowd. Cradled in his arms was a small statue carved from a strange green material. The hooded man walked swiftly out of sight, moving through the ring of flame before Jesse could garner what the idol represented. "Flee from this place, Jesse Billieu, lest unnumbered eyes fall upon you," the god of the dead warned. Then, Baron Samedi was gone. Jesse decided to heed the god's words. He silently crept away from the fire and the noise of the drums. Was the Baron right? Should he, at last, approach civilization again? How he longed to be free of the mud and the rain, to eat properly cooked food. He would find somewhere safe to sleep, then consider it in the morning. There wasn't much time, as his next transformation was approaching with the growing face of the moon. Chapter 9. Russian, 2020. Rural Cambodia. On what he assumed to be another unremarkable morning, Jesse was strolling through a pocket of broadleaf ferns when an unfamiliar smell filtered into his nostrils. There was chicken, rice, and abundant spices. It was the smell of properly cooked food, meaning people were nearby. "I can't go," Jesse shook his head. It had been so long since he'd interacted with another person that he was afraid he wouldn't know how anymore. Was he even a man, or was he a thing of the forest? Yet, he couldn't help the voice of Baron Samedi ringing in his ears. The time to return was coming, though that encounter had been weeks ago now. Despite his best intentions to remain a ghost in the forest, Jesse had slowly begun edging towards his humanity. He'd taken shelter in abandoned ruins instead of beneath the endless trees, and not just because the ruins provided food, mainly in the form of abundant vermin scurrying about, but due to something deeper in his subconscious. The pull for the sounds, sights, and tastes of civilization grew stronger in him by the day. Jesse paused and contemplated the foreign smell he'd come across. It was a fragrant curry. Something delightful was being prepared, and it was a powerful enticer. He could almost see himself as an old-school cartoon character, letting the wafting odor pick him up and carry him to its source. A slave to his base desire to eat a meal that wasn't raw rodent, Jesse wrapped his tattered cloak around himself and pulled the hood up, masking his face in shadow. His heightened senses told him in which direction to travel. He emerged from the forest at the edge of a rice plantation. The stalks were small and vibrantly green, with many drowned in the puddles that dominated the field. Some distance away, a man was pushing a strange device along the rows of crops. It was a tractor motor on wooden wheels with 2 long handles. Jesse watched him curiously, and not just for the man's actions. It had been so long since he'd seen another person, it was like looking at the illusion of a thing he'd forced himself to erase all memory of. Islands of trees emerged periodically through the rice field, and Jesse decided to use them to mask his approach. Different areas of the field had been fenced off, though fence was hardly the right word. Sticks and branches, collected from the forest without any regard for their uniformity of shape and size, had been stuck in the mud and linked with loops of rope and fishing wire. These were no impediments to Jesse. A series of wooden buildings, like incomplete open-faced sheds, sat on the edge of the field. If he could reach them, he would surely come across a road. Hunger had awoken in Jesse like a sleeping beast roaring to life. God, was he ever hungry! His mind made up, he began his dart through mud and water to the closest island of trees. Jesse made it to the sheds undetected, except by the chickens, who clucked in annoyance at his proximity to their coop. Several stray dogs growled but wouldn't come near him, which Jesse was thankful for. Fighting animals had proven to be a most unpleasant experience. A dirt road connected the shed with the thin patch of distant forest. The smell of food was stronger here. He quickly determined that he had to follow the road back into the sparse jungle to find its source. Jesse could see the optimistic blue sky stretching for miles around, unimpeded by tall trees. The new and rather hopeless optimism in him had him believing that heading towards the town was the right choice, and Jesse didn't protest this inner voice. It took half an hour of cautious walking before Jesse arrived at the settlement. Hiding in the forest was removed as an option, as there weren't enough trees to conceal his haggard form. Jesse had to reveal his dirty, shaggy, tattered figure to the world. As he ducked past shrines erected on poles and slinked by the cows that wandered the streets, Jesse couldn't help but feel a slight embarrassment at how he must look. The rustic village was serene in its simplicity, and so very green. Of the half a dozen or so people he encountered, none paid him any heed, other than an odd look here or there. As the road widened, leading back out into the wilderness, Jesse found the source of the tempting odor. A two-story building, looking suspiciously like a pub, rose from the jungle as an inviting giant welcoming him. Jesse had to forget his greed and hunger for a moment. There were more smells, though not the stink of the jungle with which he was so acquainted. Something was out of place. Jesse walked the circumference of the building and quickly found the oddity. Two vehicles, polished, though splashed with mud, were sitting by the main entry. They did not fit the usual transports he'd seen out here, as they were modern and expensive. Through the rear windows, he could see that they were jam-packed with boxes and boxes of equipment. Several crates were marked with a familiar logo, one he'd seen before. "I heal genetics," Jesse murmured, his eyes widening in wonderment. Perhaps the man... What was his name? Napier! That was it, and the woman, Mia, were back. The slaughter at the drug runner's compound could have ruined their plans entirely. If they were here now, did that mean there were other options for them in Southeast Asia? Desire to know, and to untangle this mysterious thread burned in him. Still, Jesse submitted to caution as he surveyed the building's access and egress points. He avoided the main entry and found a side door. It was locked, though a little effort saw the wooden latch splinter easily. He crept down a dark hall and into the main entertaining area. It was a bar. Liquors, dull with dust, were stacked on hand-crafted shelves behind a long bench top. Several men, looking to be farmers, sat near the bar in huddled conversation. Not far from them, at a round table, sat three foreigners. Jesse didn't recognize any of them, though noted they were equally absorbed in their own discussion. Light filtered in through the windows, illuminating only certain portions of the expanse. There were many dark corners to hide in here, even for a silhouette as large as his. Jesse wondered if the villagers ever sat in the shadows and discussed conspiracies, as this seemed the perfect venue to do so. Today, the secretive voids of light would serve him in his mission of discovery. Jesse slunk along the wall towards the foreigners and sat down. He was well within eavesdropping distance, though much to his disappointment, the conversation was in Russian. Suddenly feeling foolish and very exposed, Jesse got up, intending to leave, when he was noticed. "You there," a jarring Russian voice called. Jesse froze, his stomach doing somersaults. He didn't need to turn to know that he was the focus of the remark. "You are a foreigner in these lands too." Jesse nodded reluctantly, ensuring his hood still covered his face. "Come and sit with us. Do not take this as an insult, but you appear well acquainted with these lands." Jesse paused, considering his options. His inner voice screamed at him to run, but he couldn't trust that voice anymore. For too long it had been removed from the world of people. Then the food arrived. Jesse salivated as the exotic aromas danced through his nostrils. He must have looked like a starved puppy, as the Russian who'd called on him seized on this opportunity with unexpected fervor. "You look hungry. I will order another plate. You take mine." Jesse's body betrayed his mind as he moved to the table, a slave to desire. He sat down, and without a word, put his face to the bowl. Like a beast gorging itself from a trough, he ate with no dignity. Jesse consumed the meal like what he'd become, a thing of the woods. When he raised his face from the bowl, feeling satisfied like he hadn't in months, he finally took in the men's appearances. Only the centre person, who'd called him, had a cheery demeanour. He was bespectacled and scrawny, whereas the other two looked serious and battle-hardened. It wasn't a stretch of logic to assume that they could have been the skinny man's bodyguards. The serious pair assessed Jesse with a reproachful gaze, as if they'd just witnessed an illicit display without being allowed to consent. The cheery man, however, raised a hand when Jesse was done. "Viktor Petrov," he smiled. Jesse grunted in response. He didn't want to give his name. "And you are?" "Steve," Jesse mumbled after a noticeable pause, not sounding remotely convincing. "Well, Steve, I must say, we did not expect to see any other foreigners out here. You must have quite the story to tell." Victor chattered animatedly. He looked young, around Jesse's age, if not a little older. Jesse observed his own yellowed nail beds, painfully conscious of how dirty he was. If the Russian had noticed Jesse's wretched appearance, he didn't comment on it, almost as if he expected this. "Where are we?" Jesse asked quietly, his voice hoarse and raspy from lack of use. Victor didn't react to the oddity of the question. "Very rural Cambodia." "Cambodia?" Jesse repeated. "Why are you here?" "We are looking for some old ruins. Here, I will show you a picture." Victor handed Jesse his phone, which displayed an image of a crumbling temple. Jesse had come across it days ago. He considered it an obvious landmark and had stayed well clear ever since. Victor was able to read Jesse's face. "You have seen it?" he grinned. "Yes," Jesse nodded, not bothering to lie. "Why do you want to go there?" Victor seemed flummoxed by the question, as if the answer was so obvious Jesse was a fool to ask. It wasn't obvious to Jesse, though. Why would I-Heal Genetics be looking for an old temple? "I am a scientist who studies these kinds of things," Victor shrugged, almost as if trying too hard to seem unconcerned. Jesse eyed him warily. Victor noticed, and, desiring to appear completely non-threatening, changed tact. "Do you live around here?" he asked politely. Jesse shrugged and muttered, "My business, not yours." Victor smiled. The boy was cocky, and Jesse didn't like that. He had an air of academic success about him that made him feel false and untrustworthy. Jesse abruptly stood up. "I need to go. Thank you for the food." Victor rose to his feet, motioning to the two other men to stay down. The bodyguards now appeared on the edge of their seats, waiting to spring into action on Victor's command. "Wait, we could use a man of your knowledge. Take us to the temple, and I can pay you handsomely for your efforts." Jesse shook his head. "I can offer you more than money. What do you want?" Victor asked plainly, his quivering voice betraying a hint of desperation. "To be left alone," Jesse stated, intending that to be the end of the discussion. "Then I can help you," Victor exclaimed, his eyes lighting up. "I do not wish to cast unjust aspersions upon you, but we know that a fugitive is being hunted by the Australian government through these lands. It does not take a detective to work out it is you." "Prove it," Jesse hissed, taking a step from the table. "I mean," Victor continued quickly, "that we do not care what crimes you have committed. If you help us, we can help you. The Australians are like dogs to your scent, as I'm sure you are aware. The forest cannot hide you forever." Jesse paused. It was, of course, common knowledge that he was being hunted. The Australians had given out pamphlets with his face on them. Perhaps the Russians were his final escape from the AST. Perhaps this is why Baron Samedi had directed him towards civilization. "What would you have me do?" "We will meet you at the edge of the road leading out of the village, once we collect and prepare our equipment, though it would take some time. If you'd like, we can offer you lodgings here." "No," Jesse snapped. He would retreat back into the forest through the night. It wasn't safe here. He was known here. "Ah, right. Well, tomorrow morning then. Meet at first light." Jesse nodded his agreement and began moving for the door. Again, Victor's bodyguards looked to be restraining themselves from getting up and pursuing Jesse. With as much haste as he could muster, Jesse fled the town. The more he considered this idea, the more he liked it. He could get up before dawn's first light and scout the meeting point. If anything was amiss, he simply wouldn't show. Perhaps the Russians could get him out of Southeast Asia altogether, drop him off somewhere he could start a new life, though it would have to be somewhere he was no danger to the innocent. He'd figure it out tomorrow. For now, Jesse would go back into the trees and enjoy the feeling of fullness in his belly. Whether it was the food or the thought of escape from the forest, Jesse wasn't sure, but something caused him to oversleep. The morning calls of the forest birds woke him as light breached the dense wall of vegetation. Jesse scrambled out of the ferns and threw on his stinking clothes. He had to get to the rendezvous point fast or risk the Russians leaving without him. He crossed the rice field with zeal and moved towards the village at a running jog. Stealth was no longer his concern. The sun hung low over the trees when he arrived at the village. Jesse barely noticed the abundant tire tracks digging into the dirt road, nor paid attention to the absence of the villagers. He was singularly focused on not being left behind. The looming shadow of the AST was always behind him, and at last he could be free of it for good. Jesse came to the point of the road where it widened and swung his head left to right. There was no one here. He'd missed them. Then, a voice with a strong Russian accent sprang up from a nearby house. "You are late," Victor called, sounding nervous. Jesse began to murmur his apologies, but paused as an array of odors filled his nostrils. He smelled weapons, and something else he'd experienced of the AST. Silver. Men were emerging from buildings all around. Rifles were raised and pointed right at him. These were not drug runners, but soldiers or mercenaries. It was painfully apparent by their uniforms that they weren't AST either. The circle of men closed in on Jesse, who raised his fist defiantly. "Do not fight," a new female voice called, as a woman stepped out from behind one of the armed men. Jesse recognized her instantly. This was Mia, the eye-healed genetics representative he'd seen in the compound all those months ago. "What is this?" Jesse asked through gritted teeth. "An end to your reign of terror in these lands," Mia answered excitedly, her eyes alight with anticipation. "When Victor said he'd let you go yesterday, I was almost ready to eject him from the program. Thank God you returned this morning." "You're handing me to the AST," Jesse grimaced. "Oh no, you will be coming with us. In what manner will be up to you." "Why?" Jesse asked, the panic rising in his voice. Mia spoke with the clarity of someone who knew exactly who she was talking to. "There was an information leak. We know what the Australian government captured, and we know of the Australians' activities in these lands. When we put two and two together, we determined what they were hunting. You are a werewolf, are you not?" Jesse didn't react. He'd been so foolish. He'd been senseless. His long isolation had warped his judgment, and now he'd pay for it. "What are you going to do with me?" "Science that is almost magic," Mia sighed as if she was in love with the concept. Victor now jutted in. "I recognized you immediately yesterday, of course. Very fortuitous that you should appear right where we are. But we were not ready. I know you are dangerous, and did not want to risk you killing us and escaping." Jesse snorted with derision. He scanned the area round and round, but couldn't see anything. No way to escape. "Will you come quietly?" Mia asked. The circle of soldiers was getting tighter. The stench of their sweat and the reek of their silver accoutrements consumed Jesse. "No," Jesse stated, lunging at the nearest man with his fists clenched. His target rolled backwards and fired 2 rounds into Jesse's shoulder. Jesse gasped with pain and gripped the sizzling wound. The bullets weren't silver, and as soon as they entered his skin, Jesse could feel his superhuman body working to spit them back out. There was a flurry of activity as weapons were released to their slings and shining silver batons were drawn by a handful of the mercenaries. They began whacking Jesse's arms and legs with ferocity. Jesse fought back as best he could, but the blunt instruments carried a debilitating bite as if they were coated in poison. Each strike further infected him. Jesse's left femur broke beneath a barrage of powerful blows and seemed resistant to immediately healing. His left forearm snapped as he braced against another swing. Jesse collapsed in a crumpled heap in the middle of the road. Here, in rural Cambodia, he was defeated. An order to cease was given, and the blurry face of Mia appeared in Jesse's fading vision. "Big things are happening. You will be at the cornerstone of the scientific revolution coming. Oh, and don't worry, we will have the other Australian werewolf in good time, too. He will be the final product if our tests on you fail." There was no maliciousness in Mia's voice, just a chilling sense of purpose. An unnerving calm came over Jesse. He saw the image of Baron Samedi's skull mask flash across his vision, as if the god was commanding him not to fight anymore. Gods or no gods, it didn't matter. Jesse knew that his time for revenge would come, and he'd seize the moment when it did. The story continues in the Old World Saga, Book 3, In the Shadow of the Old World. Author's note: thank you for taking the time to listen to my first attempted reading of one of my books. If you're interested at all in checking out the Old World Saga, you can find the paperbacks and Kindle versions available on Amazon, and subscribe to my channel because I will be uploading more content about my books and about my writing journey. So stay tuned for more.